Okay, today I wanted to cover the concept of accountability. Before we get started, as always, I want to encourage you to grab a notepad, grab a pen, and make sure you take notes. Your commitment needs to be that you're going to take away something actionable from what we discussed today that you can implement in your business today. Work on something, regardless of how small. Okay, accountability. There's a word that on its surface may cause you to cringe. And indeed, on some level, all of us probably shy away from the concept of accountability at one time or another. I mean, it's definitely awkward when you need to be held accountable, when you have a conversation with someone that is holding you accountable, when you fail to come through on something, when you didn't meet expectations, and you have to have that conversation. It's very awkward and it's not comfortable. Still, I subscribe to the premise that we all actually prefer to be held accountable. We all prefer to exist in an environment of accountability. So let's look at that a little more carefully in the context of your business. First of all, if you own a business, you are inherently accountable. I mean, financially, you're certainly accountable. And as Nassim Taleb would call it, you have skin in the game. And so there is an inherent level of accountability for all business owners. And yet, there is no boss per se. There's nobody that is holding you accountable for making sure that you deliver on what you should be doing. You could say that your customers hold you accountable, and certainly that is true to a certain extent, but your customers don't oversee you the way, say, a supervisor or an employer would. So when you're self-employed, you have to look for other ways of holding yourself accountable. Maybe you have business partners, maybe you have a spouse or somebody who also has a vested interest in the success of the business who's holding you accountable. And that's a very important thing. Reflect for a moment and ask yourself what it is that in your business holds you accountable. Is it merely your financial stake in the business and the possibility, the risk you've taken, the possibility of losing that? Is it the possibility of letting someone else down? Maybe you have investors or you have dependents and people that are really relying on the success of the business. Is it a responsibility you feel to your customers? And that's what holds you accountable. There may be ways that you realize when you reflect upon this that in fact you do lack some accountability. Ask yourself if you've been procrastinating on something that you know you should be doing, something that is really important to the health of your business. It's part of your plan, maybe your business plan, or maybe it's something that we've discussed in one of these videos or you've read about, you've been advised on, your customers have given you feedback, and you just know that you need to take certain action. You have to behave in a certain way, and yet you have failed to. It may be, again, like procrastination. It may be negligence. It may be just a fear. Whatever it is, having an external source hold you accountable can be a very powerful concept. And then also let's look at the concept of accountability within your business and your team, those that help you operate the business. That's a really critical part. In fact, I have two separate videos. One that is the 4 obligations of management. We'll put a card here that you can link to it. You should definitely watch that. If you're managing people, you need to know about the 4 obligations of management. And then another that I called Management 101 and a 5-step process to management. In both of those, we talk about accountability. And so what is accountability? It's taking responsibility for your actions or lack thereof. You have to have skin in the game. You have to have consequences for what you do or fail to do. That's what being accountable is all about. So if we lived in a society or if we operated inside an environment or even within our family where there was a complete lack of accountability, it would be chaos. There would be somebody who lacks maybe some internal discipline, and they don't mind hurting others to get what they want, or they don't mind letting people down continuously, taking unfair advantage of a situation. And that's where accountability in all environments is so critical. So when we talk about your team, you owe it to your team to hold them accountable. And as I mentioned earlier, people in fact want to be held accountable. They don't admit that out loud. No one says, hey boss, here's the ways that I failed to meet your expectations. Please hold me accountable. Please pull me aside and execute consequences of some sort. Now, they may do that when they've exceeded your expectation and want to be patted on the back. That's not uncommon. And that's a symptom of maybe that you're needing to pay a little closer attention to catch people doing the right thing, as they say. But when it comes to accountability and doing things wrong, even though it's uncomfortable for you to deliver consequences and have to have those not nice talks with those that fail to meet or exceed expectations, I assure you that it is better to do that than to suffer your own consequences of the alternative. If you allow your business to operate with a culture that lacks accountability, as I mentioned, in any society, in any environment where that happens, you're going to have people sort of go hog wild, and they're going to maybe be apathetic. They don't have the skin in the game that you have in terms of investment, and maybe they don't have, or it may not be top of mind. Maybe they don't realize that if the business doesn't succeed, they should inherently realize it, but they may not think of it consciously, that if the business doesn't succeed, their employment security is at risk. And so there's an extra layer of responsibility for employers, for supervisors, for management to go out of the way to let people know where they stand and hold them accountable. So how do you do that? First of all, we have to agree that this is an important thing and that you in fact owe it to your people, you owe it to yourself, and you owe it to the business. And if you do believe that, and you believe that holding people accountable is one of the best ways to develop them and get the most out of them, and that they will appreciate it, they want to know where they stand, then if we can agree on that, then we can look at some ways of, well, in practical terms, how do we implement this on a day-to-day business within the operation of the business. So the thing that I like to do is just think of it as kind of like in baseball, 3 strikes, you're out. And this is going to sound a little bit harsh, but we have to communicate our expectations to people, and you have to be clear with people of what is expected. So I highly recommend documenting this in some sort of role description, job description, that kind of thing. And this again is one of your 4 main obligations as a manager. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that people know what's expected of them, and it comes down to them failing to meet expectations. What do you do? Well, it's strike 1. You pull somebody aside and you meet with them face to face. And then you just clearly, and it's a good idea to document stuff in writing, document it in some way. If you have a human resources manager and department, it'd be very advisable to have somebody from that department present at the meeting, but certainly the person that you're holding accountable, that you're meeting with, you're giving some sort of evaluation and feedback on their performance. The supervisor, the HR person, and the person themselves. There should be 3 people present when practical and possible. And as I say, you should document it in such a way that there can be little misgivings for what exactly was discussed, and you don't have to rely strictly on memory. If you're doing it in an environment where it's virtual, you can certainly record the meeting, and then you can agree at the end that the topic has been discussed in sufficient level to satisfy the objective of the meeting, which is to let people know where they stand and to make improvements. But the key is, in some way, you need to document this. So in strike 1, though, it's really important to ascertain the reason behind the person failing to meet expectations. And what you will often find on strike 1 is that it's not really an area where you're reprimanding anyone. In fact, it's probably going to be an opportunity to communicate in a way that clarifies expectations and let them know what it is that they should do in another situation that arises like that. Maybe there was a conflict between team members. Maybe the way they handled a customer interaction was failed to meet your expectations. The key, what you will find is, as I say, it's often not going to result on strike one as a reprimand. Instead, it's likely some sort of clarification. Like the person may say, I didn't know that you expected me to do that. I didn't know. Or they may say that it's a training situation. I don't know how to do that. I know I should have done what you're now suggesting, but I really don't know how to do that. Can you give me some training and some further instruction on how to do that? And again, so therefore there can't be any reprimand because it's your obligation to provide them with the training. Or they may say, I know how to do that. I know you expect to do that, but I'm unable to do that because we were lacking a particular resource, like the computers were down. That's why I didn't do it or whatever. All of those things are legitimate. In which case, the onus goes back onto you as the employer, as the supervisor, to make sure in the future that those situations don't recur. Like that the person now, it shouldn't recur that they don't know what's expected of them, and at least in this specific example. And it should not recur that they don't have the training, because you need to invest the time to train them and instruct them on how to do what you expect. And you should provide the resources that they need. And so what you will find on strike one, and strike one is the most frequently strike you need to issue. It's the most frequent communication and meeting you need to have in terms of increasing accountability within your organization. So don't shy away from it. You know, when people who run businesses, when managers realize that somebody failed to meet expectations, a lot of times assumptions are made as to why, and we tend to assume the worst, like the person was being defiant or apathetic or negligent, when in fact it may be that the onus was on us, and it's something that we can easily remedy with a little bit of communication. So strike number one, find out the reason why. And then what you can do as you're communicating with the person, you can kind of document what you've discussed and what the rationale was for the failure that you're holding the person accountable for, and what remedies, both from management's point of view and from the employee's perspective, are going to take place in order to avoid recurrence. Okay? So strike number two, we're talking about the same situation here. What I mean to say is, we never go on to strike number two if it's a completely different situation. So in the example of a person failing to handle a customer interaction in the way that you would expect, and it resulted in an upset customer or a customer complaint, and then you had the strike number one conversation. If the person was now late for work the next week, that's not a strike two situation. That's a strike one situation regarding punctuality. And so you would have the same sort of conversation. Why were they late? Did they not know what time they were supposed to arrive at work and be ready for work? And it's going back completely to strike number one. So when we talk about advancing to strike number two, we're talking about the same situation occurs. Maybe not every detail is the same, but in the example of a customer complaint, so the person has another customer complaint. And again, you meet with the person. Hopefully all the main stakeholders are present. You document the situation, and you start always by clarifying what it is, why you were calling the meeting, what it is you want to talk about. And then you give the person that you're holding accountable, your team member, you give them the opportunity to explain to you their side of the story. It should not be, assuming the situation is very similar to strike number one, that they say, I didn't know you expected this, because you can right away go back and say, well, we know that's not accurate because we have documented a discussion where we had this before. You absolutely know what we expect in this situation. So you shouldn't get that as an excuse, but it's not unheard of. You may, and it's okay. If you do, Now it is a reprimand. Now you are giving them a little more coaching and you are reminding them of the expectation. It could be that they forgot. They're like, oh, you know what? You're absolutely right. I forgot in those situations we're supposed to do X, Y, or Z with the customer. No excuse. Now that I think back, you're right. I should have done better. Okay, but it is strike two and you've documented it. The key with strike two is that you escalate the consequences. There weren't really any negative consequences in the case of strike one. Really, all you do in the case of strike one is you're providing them with clarification of your expectations. You're providing them with any resources or training that they may need. And you're documenting everything so that there's a clear communication. On strike two, however, you need to up it a little bit. And that's where you might actually have what is known as being written up, where you pass along the documentation, ask the person to sign that they understand. And I use the terms formal reprimand within the document. We can provide you with templates that you might want to use in your company. But the key here is that they understand this is no longer just a discussion, just a mere coaching. It's fine to also include coaching and to give them advice, especially if the person is asking for some. But instead, strike two is an escalation because there is a realization this is not as the result of a lack of clarification. This is not as the result of a lack of training and instruction. And this is not the result of a lack of a resource. Instead, this is negligence, forgetfulness, something like that, defiance, obstinance, bad attitude, apathy. We're not sure what the reason is, and in a particular example, it could be anything, but document what it is, and there's strike two. Strike three, if you do strikes one and two very effectively, you will almost never get to strike three. Strike three is you're out. Basically, if the person commits the same offense again, that is probably, now remember, there's no excuse. They have all the resources and training and the understanding of the expectations. They've been told that there's no more tolerance for this. And in strike two, you may tell them what's going to happen in strike three. If this occurs again, there may be employment termination. Some people will choose to exercise some other form besides complete employment termination on strike three, such as some kind of suspension, another penalty of some sort. And that's going to be up to individual business owners and management teams. But I would recommend that it's a very severe reprimand of some sort. It has to be very clear that this can't recur. Now, there is a caveat here I want to add to this, and that is that there is sort of a statute of limitations. So we only can have 3 strikes that result in termination. And I'm not talking about employment law here. I'm talking about best practices in terms of creating an environment of accountability within your organization. There should be a statute of limitations of, I would suggest, 6 months. And of course, it has to do with the severity of the issue that you're dealing with. I mean, if there was, say, employee violence of some sort, you may not escalate at all. It might be a 1 strike, you're out. There's no valid excuse for that kind of thing. Or there could be something severe where something maybe during strike 2 could have, or strike 1 could have been perceived as dishonesty or theft of some sort, but there's room for interpretation, and you're like, well, that can't happen 3 times in the entire course of an employment. But really, most of what happens where you're trying to develop good people within your organization can recur over time just because we're humans. And so I would suggest sort of a statute of limitations of about 6 months for most quote unquote infractions. So look at it this way. You did strike 1 in January, you had a strike 2 in maybe May or June, and then in December the person had the same situation occur, but that was 6 months beyond at least one of those infractions, so they fall off. So think of it sort of as a rolling expiration of 6 months on infractions. And as long as because we can accept certain deficiencies because we're all human. And if it's like, well, the person's late for the 3rd time in a year, I can accept that. It depends on your business. You may not be able to accept that, but apply this statute of limitations. And I just think a good round number of where to start is 6 months. Kind of make it fall off their record after 6 months. So if it's a 3rd time something's occurred and it's not the end of the world, but it is a big enough deal that they should be reprimanded, if it's beyond 6 months, then don't count the other ones as strikes. It's kind of like the foul ball where you can continue to get strikes as long as the other ones have fallen off the record. So think of the 3 strike you're out policy and try to apply that for everyone. And I'm telling you once again, this might sound harsh, but in fact, you will almost never get to strike 3. The reason, and you might be thinking as you're listening to me, no, I have a person and I encounter this problem with them 2 times a week, 3 times a month, whatever it is. And I know, Michael, I'd be firing people left, right, and center if I took this approach. I'm telling you, the only reason that you do have that is you're tolerating it. You're not doing strikes 1 and 2, or you're not executing effectively strikes 1 and 2. You need to stop what you're doing. It can't be while it's happening. So you witness something occur on the premises, or you hear about something right away, and you go and you tell the person verbally, stop doing that. You think of a busy environment, maybe a retail environment or a restaurant environment, and the manager sort of verbally chastises or reprimands somebody and tells them not to do something. That's not what we're talking about here. It needs to be formal. It needs to be documented. It should be in a face-to-face meeting. Close the door. If you're having it in a virtual environment, that's absolutely acceptable as well. But the key here is you're not doing it at the moment it happens, and certainly not when emotions might be high, okay? And not where something is just sort of glazed over. This needs to be formally thought of by both parties as an investment in the person's success. And that's a really important way to frame this, both in communications, but in your heart. What you're trying to do here is develop your people to get the most out of them, to increase their chances for success within your organization. And again, as the 4 obligations of management point out, you have to do that by clarifying your expectations, by providing them the training and resources they need, and by holding them accountable. So point that out and make sure people understand this is not a big deal. They may have come from another organization or culture where things were just sort of blown off and that they've learned really bad habits. And otherwise, they might be really skilled individuals and good people, but they've developed some bad habits based on a culture that they came from that you need to nip in the bud. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't assume what I'm saying is incorrect because you've had a different experience. Instead, what you're likely experiencing is a symptom of a deeper problem. It's a symptom of a culture that lacks accountability, that lacks a formal process for holding people accountable. Okay, so I want you to get started with that. Go back, ask yourself, try to put this in place. And think about within your organization right now, especially if you have people that work for you and you're not a one-man operation, what do you need to do to implement this? And certainly, we can help you if you need some HR assistance. Like I said, if you need a template, if you need us to help document the thing for you, if you need us to participate, we do that for all of the members of the BMI community. We can do that. And just start practicing it. Like all business skills, like all management skills, these are things you will get better at over time. Before we end though, let's get back to that concept of accountability for you at the business level. There's a couple of ways that you can implement this. And we said maybe there's other people who have a vested interest in your business partner, spouse, or something like that, your customers. Find a way to implement accountability for yourself. Like tell your people, for example, tell your team, commit to them and clarify for them what they should expect of you, and invite them, in fact, implore them to call you out when you fail to deliver. Like, let's say you say, as an example, I don't know, in payroll, we're going to pay on time and accurately every time. And if ever we fail to do so, you have my permission. In fact, you have my request to point it out to me so that I can find out what's wrong and fix it immediately. That's my commitment to you. So deliver to your team commitments of those things that you know you need to be held accountable for. And what I would encourage you to do is make those commitments surrounding those areas that you know you could use a little assistance with accountability, that maybe you tend to procrastinate, or you lack a little bit of discipline, or you don't have your finger as close on the pulse of that business as on that part of the business as you should have. Make those commitments to your staff and ask them to hold you accountable, or to your spouse or to your business partners. Maybe you've done some self-analysis and introspection and you realize, this is something that I'm a little weak at, and you tell people, I want you to help me with this. Could you please let me know and give me some constructive criticism when you find I'm doing this wrong or I'm failing to meet expectations of the organization. The other thing that you should do is that same process with your customers. So ask your customers for feedback. The more customer feedback you can get through reviews and testimonials, complaints, positive feedback, it's all good. You have to put mechanisms in place, surveys, whatever it is, get some customer feedback loop in place so that you can respond to what your customers are telling you. And this is for you. This is a tool for you to improve and to improve your business. So don't manipulate those so that you're only getting positive feedback. If your customers are actually disappointed about something and they feel that you've incented them in some way to only give positive feedback, then you're not going to get honest criticism that you can use to improve. Now, I can appreciate you may want your customers to more privately criticize you and more publicly praise you. That's completely understandable, and that's a best practice. So before they post a 1-star Google review on something, and you say, oh, hey, Michael said I should really appreciate that and I can make the improvement, that might happen, and it's more reactive for that to occur, and then you go and fix the problem and then ask them to amend or modify the review to reflect the current situation. Instead, put a mechanism in place where you can catch things, you can nip them in the bud before a person's inclined to publicly criticize your company with, say, a Yelp or a Google review that's pretty scathing. So we, again, can help you. If you don't know, if you're not good at surveys and you don't know, well, how can I do this with my customers? We can assist you with that. The key is find mechanisms to hold yourself and your organization accountable. When you don't have a supervisor directly or a boss per se, aside from your customers and your own team holding you accountable, you have to find a way. And then, of course, we should promote, at BMI, we have what's known as our VIPs group, and that's a peer support group that you can join, and we hold one another accountable. And so I'd encourage you to look into that. If you just know that you would respond well to a regular meeting in which you make commitments and then you're held accountable for coming back and having taken action on delivering on those commitments, and having people who understand what it's like to be self-employed and all the challenges and the various demands on your time and people pulling you in all directions, people who are experiencing the exact same thing you are, for them to get together with you and give you encouragement, but that accountability is there. There's something about our VIPs group where people come back, they do their homework, they deliver on their action items, because nobody wants to go before their peers who are reciprocating that, not only accountability, but that commitment to delivering, and be the only one who's sort of feeling like they didn't do it. It's a very powerful concept. So we're going to leave it at that today. Please leave some suggestions and comments. Is there something that I missed here? What practices do you use in your business to deliver accountability and to foster a culture of accountability that leads to everyone's improvement? Thanks for tuning in today. Perpetually refine.